Welcome to Fascist Economics 101.
The New York Times wrote an article on 5 companies that the U.S. government has formed unusual deals with. For what I'm describing in this episode, I'm going to talk about 4 of these. The 4 companies are U.S. Steel, NVIDIA, AMD, and Intel. Now, this episode covers how the White House owning shares of stock gives it power over a company. And this episode uses terms such as shares of stock, boards of directors, and activist investors. If you're unfamiliar with these, I made a special mini episode that explains these, so some of the points I make later in this episode will make a lot more sense if you go and check out the mini episode first. Anyway, about these 4 companies. U.S. Steel is the second largest steel manufacturer in the U.S. So what did they give Trump? Well, Trump now gets the power to appoint a board member and have a say in company decisions. What did they receive in return for this deal? Nothing. NVIDIA, worth $4.3 trillion, is one of the main computer chip manufacturers behind the AI boom. What did they give Trump? Well, 15% of the revenue from NVIDIA's H2O series chip sales in China is diverted to the White House now. What did they receive in return for this deal? Nothing. Advanced Micro Devices, AMD, is also a major chip manufacturer. And what did they give Trump? AMD is diverting 15% of their China sales to Uncle Sam. What did they receive in return for this deal? Nothing. And then there's Intel, a major computer hardware manufacturer. What did they give Trump? A 10% stake worth $8.9 billion. Now, the U.S. government had previously committed to a $5.7 billion investment into Intel as part of the Biden-era CHIPS Act, and the Trump administration will deliver that investment because they're legally required to. However, Intel isn't required to give the U.S. government any stock in return for this investment, so Intel is giving Trump that 10% investment for free. And what did they receive? Just the money that they were already going to be given. So, nothing. These actions violate norms about how a country like the U.S. is supposed to behave. We're supposedly a capitalist country. To capitalist ideology, competition makes us stronger. We exist in a global market. We compete with foreign companies, and that competition keeps us sharp. But with NVIDIA and AMD giving the White House 15% of their China sales, that means their costs will functionally be higher, which means they won't even be able to compete with much of the Chinese market, which means that they won't have as much of an incentive to innovate and compete with foreign brands. Sure, American and Taiwanese chips are better than Chinese chips for now, but we don't know what the future holds. Chinese electric cars already outperform American electric cars. It's embarrassing. And the more barriers there are, the larger that gap will grow. The narrative here is that this is the projection of government power. The U.S. is swinging its weight around, showing that it can extract payments and ownership from the most powerful companies in America. The Trump administration wants to make big companies bend the knee. Now, the Trump administration is justifying these moves on national security grounds. There have been many times, even in recent history, when the U.S. government has invested in or nationalized companies on the basis of national security. Now, I'm going to defer to Scott Kennedy on this. Scott Kennedy is a senior advisor and trustee chair in Chinese business and economics at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. In his words, quote, "If there's a legitimate national security concern about exporting these chips to China, then I don't see how the payments to the US government address those risks. In fact, they don't at all. And if there's not a sufficient national security risk, or they can be adequately mitigated, then the US government should just get out of the way and expect nothing in return. What Scott Kennedy brings up is a good point. None of this is how you solve a national security problem. Convincing companies to give part of their China revenues to the White House does not change the national security calculation of whether selling those AI chips to China is a good idea in the first place. All that these voluntary agreements amount to is the White House making a transparent cash grab because they don't protect national security. It's hard for we who grew up in a capitalist society to understand what's happening. For us to wrap our heads around this, we need to go way back in humanity's political history. Think back to ancient governments. Back then, if a city was scared of a neighboring tyrant, the city would sometimes give gold and other gifts to appease the tyrant. This happened all over the ancient world, with the Aztecs, the Chinese, and even the Egyptians. The word for these gifts of appeasement is tribute. Now, I'm not part of these companies, so I can't speak to their motives. But looking at the context of the economic terror that Donald Trump is causing, especially with the mass raid on Hyundai's plant in Georgia, we have American companies giving free resources to a chaotic authoritarian leader. That looks like tribute. The concept of tribute is profoundly anti-American. We are an independent people. From the founding of our country, we have opposed kings, big and small, who thought that they could walk all over us. Let's take a look back in our country's history. America fought for freedom in 1776. 23 years later, that's 1797, there was a major political scandal called the XYZ Affair. The situation was that American representatives met with the French to avoid war. However, the French representatives demanded an enormous bribe for the negotiation to continue. It was widely known at the time that other countries didn't mind paying bribes to the French for negotiations like this, but the Americans were offended and left. Americans were so enraged over the French request for a bribe that the main political party in favor of peace backed out, and we had a quasi-war with France for 2 years. One of the main cultural takeaways from all this is a quote from U.S. Congressman Robert Goodloe Harper. "Millions for defense, but not 1 cent in tribute." Meaning that we as a country would rather maintain our dignity of independence from tyrants than let them rule us through fear. And he was right. This quote, "millions for defense, but not 1 cent in tribute," has guided how Americans think about foreign policy from 1797 to today. So now, it looks like we have American companies appearing to pay tribute to Donald Trump, and we must ask ourselves how far we have fallen that Americans are allowing this to happen. Okay, that's it for philosophy. Let's get back to business. One of the most important things going on here is stock ownership. The White House has received a 10% stake in Intel, currently worth $8.9 billion, and they get shareholder-like powers with U.S. Steel to boot. What does it mean that the U.S. government has acquired such large stakes in these companies? Well, owning this magnitude of shares in these companies doesn't mean that Donald Trump controls them, but it does mean that he holds significant power over them. For anything from corporate policy to who the CEO is, the White House could potentially be the deciding vote on any issue. It means that in every decision, corporate executives at Intel and U.S. Steel now need to ask themselves not just what's best for the company, but what's best for the White House. In other words, Donald Trump can now act as a powerful activist investor. Additionally, it's a mark of approval. If the White House is investing in a company, what message does that send? It seems like the White House is giving approval of that company. It reeks of favoritism and unfair competition. So, to recap, the federal government has been swinging its weight around. Companies are giving favor after favor to the White House. The only way for us to make sense of all this is to fit this into an intellectual framework. Now, in my framework episode, I walked through how fascism has its own economic system. As I outlined in that episode, for fascist governments to manage the economy, they divide the economy into winners and losers. They punish the losers to create an atmosphere of terror, and then they basically deputize the winners to go out and advance fascist goals. Last episode, we looked at how the government used ICE and other departments to close down a major factory owned by Hyundai, the South Korean car company. That spread a lot of terror throughout the business world. Companies are now keenly aware of what the Trump administration is willing to do, and business leaders are desperate to stay on the White House's good side. So let's look at the other side of that coin. For business leaders who want to stay out of Trump's crosshairs, they can do what are called signaling behaviors. Signaling is when you do something to show something. For example, buying an expensive car to show that you're wealthy is a signaling behavior. Now, the problem with all this is that signaling behaviors come in many forms, and they are almost always legal and public. So it's impossible to say definitively what a given action was or wasn't meant to signal, if anything. Again, I'm not part of US Steel, NVIDIA, AMD, or Intel. I can't tell you why they do anything. But these voluntary agreements will inform the Trump administration's understanding of how these companies and corporate America as a whole will be willing to engage with it in the future. I expect the Trump administration and the broader business world to interpret these deals as a signal of intended future cooperation. Putting that into our framework, these deals will have the societal effect of drawing lines between the winners and losers of our increasingly fascist economic system, and that's exactly what the fascists want. All right. So that's the latest going on in fascist economics. We're all giving tribute to the king. Thank you so much for listening. If you're interested in hearing more, please like and subscribe, and I hope you come back around.